Ha! Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Monday evening. Still bright daylight, but tonight will come in Gimel Tammuz, which is the yard site of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. But I think we'll dedicate our learning to him tomorrow when it's actually on Gimel Tammuz. So let's make sure we do that. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Oh, Facebook. Okay. Here we go. Steven in New Hampshire, Yehud in South Carolina, Bill in Missouri, Guy in Ohio, Sharon in New Jersey, Paul in the Great Northwest, Lucy in Minnesota, Bell in Florida, Jonathan north of LA, Sharon. It's so warm this evening that I'm in my floating chair in the pool studying tonight. I love it. Belle in Texas, Tom in PA, Lorraine in Texas, Karen in Northern California, Marjorie in Georgia, Chaim in Florida. Welcome, everybody. Very interesting daf tonight. Our page is Yud Gimel, page 13, here in Tractate Bava Basra, the 23rd volume of the Talmud. Continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 5. Partners who co-own a field, a garden, a courtyard. Can one force the other to divide it? They co-own it. They both have the rights to it. But if one of them wants to divide it, he can force the other. You know, we're going to split it. You take your half, I'll take mine. But only if, after they divide it, it's big enough that what's left would have the same name. It would still be considered a field. It would still be considered a courtyard. It would still be considered a garden when it was half the size. If it drops to such a small size that it couldn't really have the same identity as what it had before it was divided, then the one who wants to force the division will not be permitted to force that division. And tonight we're going to encounter some really interesting teachings because the Mishna also spoke about dividing a scroll of sacred writings. We're actually going to learn some halachas and requirements of Torah scrolls and other sacred writings. Fascinating. I'm also going to just mention that I'm going to be traveling next Sunday. And of course, we'll announce this again as we get closer to it. But on Sunday, there won't be class. I'm sorry, on Sunday there will, because I'm going to get to Florida in time to teach the class on Sunday. Monday, I'm going to be tied up coaching at the qualifier for the Maccabiah games. So no class on Monday. Yes, on Tuesday. Probably not on Wednesday when I travel back to LA. Okay, and then we'll publish that schedule. But the point is that there most likely will not be an AT Daily class next Monday and Wednesday, a week from today. All right. 13a, right near the top. The Mishnah, our Mishnah, number 5, here in chapter 1, teaches that a hall, a drawing room, and the like should not be divided unless the two parties will be able to use their respective portions in the same manner that they had previously used them. So the Gemara asks, what is the law if there is not enough for this one and for that one? If it's too small and they can't divide it. So what is to be done if one of the parties wishes to dissolve the partnership? Okay, you can't divide the space, but this guy doesn't want to be in a partnership co-owning something with the other. So what do? So Rav Yehuda said there is a halacha of. So there is a law. This is not universal. Not all the sages hold by this halacha, by this Torah law, but some do. And this law would say, either you set a price or I will set a price. Which is to say, one party can say to the other, set a price that you are willing to pay for my share, and I will sell my share to you or purchase your share from you at that price. And Rav Nachman said, there is no halacha of either you set or I will set. Right? So the ones who hold by this law, and it's the same idea, like if two people are buying a quantity of something, like they're going to buy an ounce of something, like, oregano or cumin or saffron, or some other spice, right? And they're going to buy an ounce, and so they get the ounce price, but they need to split it, right? So one of them will make the two piles, and then he'll say to the other, now you pick your pile. Right? Since he's not going to be the one who picks, he's going to make very sure that the two piles are equal. And this is a great system. One does the dividing and the other one does the choosing. And likewise, when you say that one partner has to buy out the other partner, one of them says, okay, you set the price for the buyout. And then I'll either let you buy me out or I will buy you out. Right? And so the second one is going to have that choice. And of course, that's going to motivate the first one to set a very fair price because he doesn't know if he's going to become the buyer or the seller. He's going to make sure that the price is the most fair that it can be. So Rava said to Rav Nachman, according to you who say that there is no halacha of either you set or I will set the price, so what should they do if there was a firstborn and an ordinary brother whose father left them a slave and a non-kosher animal as an inheritance? How are they to be divided? Right? So if you have a slave, and slaves we've seen before, it's terrible that in the ancient world slavery existed. Thank God it no longer exists. But we have to deal with the economic laws as they existed in the ancient world. So a slave obviously is something you cannot cut in half, right? You could say that the slave will work for you one day and for me one day. Here there's the wrinkle of it's a firstborn and a regular son, so the firstborn gets a double portion. So you could say that the slave will work for you 2 days and for me 1 day, the regular brother. And that way they would divide up the time of the slave. But maybe this doesn't make sense. Maybe one brother lives in one city, the other brother lives in another city, and they're not going to send the slave back and forth. So what they really need to do is a buyout, right? So they have a non-kosher animal. Presumably that would mean like a beast of burden, maybe a mule, and the slave, right? So they're both productive, right? They both can produce work. And they have value in this way. It's non-kosher, so it's not something you're going to sell and slaughter and eat. So it's a work animal and the slave. So one way to do this, to split the value, of course, would be to say, oh, what would this slave and this animal bring on the market? That's the market price. And then one of the brothers, and then you have to divide it maybe 1/3, 2/3, because there's a firstborn brother involved. But once you set the price, okay, so then one of them will either do the buying or the selling. As long as the price is fair, it doesn't really matter. The one who gets bought out could then use the proceeds, to purchase another slave, maybe a less expensive slave, or, combine that money with other money to get a slave that does the same kind of tasks, right? So one way is to establish what the value is, and then one buys out the other. Now, in this case, Rav Nachman, so the one who doesn't believe in buyouts, Rav Nachman said to him, I say that they work for this one, the ordinary brother, 1 day, and for the other one, 2 days. We don't do a buyout, we just share the time of the slave. But the Gemara raised an objection to Rav Yehuda's approach from what is taught in a Mishna in Tractate Gittin. One who is half slave and half free man, for example, a slave who had been jointly owned by 2 people, one of whom emancipated the slave, serves his master 1 day, the remaining master, and himself 1 day, right? This slave who is half slave and half free, 1 day he works for his master, the next day he works for himself. For example, he could be, earning money, saving up money so that he could purchase his freedom from the remaining half master, right? So one who is half slave, half free, serves his master one day and himself for one day. This is the statement of Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai say, well, you have remedied the situation of his master, who benefits fully from all his rights to the slave. Okay, so the slave who owns half the master who has a half ownership in the slave, he's getting the work of the slave half the time, so his problem is solved. The master is getting what he's supposed to get. But what about the slave who is working for himself half the time? Why doesn't that solve his problem? Because he can't get married. Beis Shammai say you have remedied the situation of his master, who benefits fully from all his rights to the slave, but you have not remedied the slave's own situation. He cannot marry a female slave, since half of him is free, and a free Jew may not marry a Canaanite maidservant, a Canaanite female slave. He is also not able to marry a free woman, since half of him is a slave, and a Jewish woman may not marry a Canaanite slave. And if you say he should be idle and not marry, okay, so why is marriage so important? Let's say he doesn't get married, and then there's no problem. But is it not true that the world was created only for procreation? As it is stated, Isaiah 45:18, he did not create it to be a waste. He formed it to be inhabited, right? And so that's the further source for the, sort of a backup for the law, which is the very first commandment, be fruitful and multiply. And that's why we learn that every man is commanded to have children. Well, obviously, you can't have children without a female partner, but women are not obligated to have children because, especially in the ancient world, it was dangerous for a woman to give birth. Some number of women would die in childbirth. So women are not obligated to procreate, but men are. And here we're talking about this male slave, right? So you can't just say, well, okay, since you're half man, since you're half free, half slave, so you won't get married. But then that violates his obligation to procreate. So rather, what they do is that the court forces his master to make him a free man by emancipating the half that he owns. And the court writes a bill in which the slave accepts responsibility to pay half of his value to his master, right? So the slave is the one who is half slave, half free, he is going to be able to force the master who owns half of him to emancipate him, but not for free. The slave will owe that amount of money to his now former master, but the master doesn't have a choice. He has to emancipate. He has to emancipate this slave who is half slave and half free. And the ultimate version of the Mishna records the retraction of Beis Hillel. And Beis Hillel retracted its opinion and ruled in accordance with the statement of Beis Shammai in this matter. And this indicates that it is only in this case, where there is the particular consideration of procreation, that the court compels one of the parties to forfeit his portion and dissolve the partnership. But in other cases, there is no halacha of either you set or I will set the buyout price and I will force the buyout, right? It seems that in this case of the half slave, half free, the reason why they compel the master of half the slave to emancipate what he owns is because of the issue of procreation. But were it not for the issue of procreation, they wouldn't force this buyout, is what is now being argued. And the Gemara answers, it is different here because the slave can say, I will set a price, but he is not able to say, you set a price. In other words, the slave cannot offer to sell himself because his Jewish side precludes him from selling himself as a Canaanite slave. Therefore, the court, see, this was not a Jew to begin with, but a Canaanite slave, while he is owned by a Jew, actually becomes obligated in most of the commandments. And then when he goes free, he can become a Jew. Right? So that's what we're talking about here. So this guy, he is halfway there to be a Jew. And it's enough that he cannot sell that part of him back into Canaanite slavery. Therefore, the court would not be able to force the master to sell his share were it not for the consideration of procreation. By contrast, in a situation where either side can be the buyer or the seller, one partner can compel the other to either buy his portion or sell his portion to him, meaning either you will set the price or I will set the price, but we can force the buyout. That is the law. Not all the sages held by it, but it is in fact the law. Now, the Gemara suggests, come in here a proof from that which is taught in a Mishna on page 172a of this tractate, in a case where there are two brothers, one poor and one rich, and their father left them a bathhouse or an olive press as an inheritance. So if the father had built these facilities for profit, i.e. to charge others for using them, well, then the profit that accrues after the father's death is shared equally by the two brothers, right? So if the father had built an olive press that he rents out to the local olive growers for them to, press the olives and extract the olive oil, etc. So the father had a business set up with this olive press, and then the father died. Okay, so the two sons inherit that business. And they continue to just divide the profits from that business. They don't do anything with the olive press. They continue renting it out as before, and they simply split the profits. That's if the father built the olive press or the bathhouse as a business to rent it out. But if the father used it for himself, then it's not so simple. If the father had built them for himself, and for the members of his household to use, this olive press or this bathhouse, then, and we have a rich brother and a poor brother who are inheriting it, then the poor brother, who has little use for such amenities, right? He doesn't need an olive press, he doesn't have an olive orchard, he doesn't need a bathhouse, to be used for spa, like he's too busy working. We're not talking about a toilet, we're talking about like a bathhouse. So this is not going to be of as great a use. A private bathhouse or a private olive press is not going to be so useful to the personal situation of the poor brother. And in that situation, the poor brother cannot force the rich brother to convert the facilities to commercial use. Rather, the rich brother can say to the poor brother, go take servants for yourself and they will bathe in the bathhouse. Or he can say, go take olives for yourself and come and transform them into oil in the olive press. In other words, the rich brother is saying, hey, you have the right to use this olive press or this bathhouse just like me. I'm sorry, you don't consider it useful, but you have the right to use it as much as I do. And when you find a use for it, when you're able to use it, because you're, become a little bit wealthier, then you'll come and use it. So evidently, the poor brother cannot say to him, buy my share. And the Gemara rejects this proof. There too, the poor brother can say, you set a price and buy my share, as the rich brother has the means to buy his poor brother's portion. But the poor brother is not able to say, or else I will set a price and buy your share, as the poor brother does not have the money to buy his brother out. So in other words, they can't force you set or I will set, can't force the buyout where the idea is we're going to one of us sets the price and the other one has the choice to buy or sell. Since the poor brother cannot afford to buy, that choice isn't available. That's why it's not available. Now, the poor brother can overcome this by borrowing the money so that he can take half the asset if he chooses to buy. Right, so that would put that choice back on the table. If he says, well, I'm prepared, if I'm going to end up buying, like he could say, I'll do the dividing and then you buy or sell, right? Or you do the dividing and then I'll buy or sell. And the rich brother could say, who are you kidding? You don't have the means to buy. And the poor brother can say, well, I will borrow, right? I will borrow. And it's a good deal because if he buys this thing, then he could turn around and sell it, right? And then make some kind of a profit and at least get back to the situation. Even if he sells it for what he paid for it, he'll end up with, he'll pay back the loan and end up with the other half, the other half of the money. So it does work to buy or sell, you set or I will set, even with a poor brother and rich brother, as long as the poor brother is willing to borrow in order to buy, if that's the choice he ends up making. Now, the Gemara further proposes, and that is one of the proofs why we do have this law. Now the Gemara further proposes a different proof. Come in here a proof from that which is taught in a baraisa. Anything which, even after it is divided, anything which, even after it is divided, each of the parts retains the name of the original item, may be divided, right? That's what we said at the top of the class. If you want to force the division, it can only be forced if the thing that you're going to divide is large enough so that when it's divided in half, the two resulting halves maintain the identity of a field or of a garden or of a courtyard, right? They have to have that minimum size. Now, and if the parts will not, now in the Baraisa as opposed to our Mishna, and if the parts will not retain the original name, then, and by the way, we are on 13b now, if the part will not retain the original name, the item should not be divided, but rather its monetary value is assessed because one of the joint owners can say to the other, either you set or I will set the price, and then one of them buys out the other. And the Gemara explains, actually, this matter is a dispute between Tanaim, sages of the Gemara, as it is taught in a Baraisa, if a courtyard or the like was not large enough to warrant division into two parts, and one of the co-owners said to the other, you take a minimum measure of the courtyard, for example, 4 cubits, and I will take less. Then the court listens to him. So Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says they do not listen to him, right? So they're arguing about this as well. And the Gemara clarifies the Baraisa. So what are the circumstances of this new case we're talking about? If we say it is exactly as it is taught, well, then what is Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel's reasoning? Why does he rule that the court ignores the party who's prepared to settle for less? Rather, is it not that the Baraisa is incomplete? And this is what it is really saying. If one of the co-owners said to the other, you take a minimum measure of the courtyard and I will take less, all agree that the court listens to him. And the Tan of the Baraisa adds, and if one of them says, either you set a price and buy it from me or I will set a price and buy it from you, they also listen to him. And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel comes to say, in the first case, the court does listen to him. But they do not listen to him when he says, either you set or I will set a price. Accordingly, this issue is the subject of a Tanaitic dispute where the size is too small for an equal division and leaving two parts that have the minimum size. Now, the Gemara rejects this interpretation of that Baraisa. No, the Baraisa should actually be understood exactly as it is taught. And with regard to what you said, what is Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel talking about? Why can't one of the parties say that they should divide the property and he will settle for less? Why can't he say that? In other words, why does Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel say he's not allowed to say that? It is because the second one can say to him, if you want me to compensate you with money for the difference between my share and your share, I have no money to give you. And if you wish to give it to me as a gift, I am not at ease with that. As it is written, but he who hates a gift shall live. So you should pay your own way. And the Baraisa indicates that there is a law of either you set or I will set the price in accordance with the opinion of Rav Yehuda. In other words, we do have support that there is the forced buyout using the law of either you set the price or I will set the price and the other one buys out. As a continuation of this discussion, Abaye said to Rav Yosef, that statement of Rav Yehuda is actually the opinion of Shmuel, his teacher, as we learned in the Mishnah on page 11a. But in the case of sacred writings, a scroll of any of the 24 books of the Bible that were inherited by two people, they may not divide them, even if both of them wish to do so, because it would be a show of disrespect to cut the scroll in half, right? In other words, like the case of the slave who needs to procreate, we have an additional consideration that you cannot divide a scroll of sacred writings because even if the two parties would be willing to do it, it's disrespectful to Scripture to take a scroll and cut it in half and leave, two halves that by themselves are incomplete. Because it would be disrespectful. Wait a minute. But in the case of sacred writings, i.e. a scroll of any of the 24 books of the Bible that are inherited by two people, they may not divide them, even if both wish to do so, because it would be a show of disrespect to cut the scroll in half. And Shmuel said they taught that sacred writings should not be divided only if they are contained in a single scroll. But where they are contained in two scrolls, that they may divide. right? So for example, if you take, I suppose what they're saying is, if you had the book of Psalms, right, which is rather a very lengthy book in the Bible, and so the 150 Psalms of the book of Psalms, what if that was divided into 2 scrolls? So you need both books together to have the entire book of Psalms, but it has already been divided into 2 scrolls, right? Because one scroll would have been too unwieldy. So it's already divided into 2 scrolls. So if it's already divided into 2 scrolls, Shmuel would say you can, the two brothers who inherited that from their father, one can take, the first half of the book of Psalms and the other can take the second half. Not because they're cutting a scroll in half, but because they're just each taking half of the book, since it was already divided into 2 scrolls. Shmuel says that, unclear whether the others disagree. Let's see. And Shmuel said they taught that sacred writings should not be divided only if they're contained in a single scroll. And you're not going to cut the parchment in half. But when they are already contained in 2 scrolls, they may be divided. And if it should enter your mind to say that there is no law of either you set a price or I will set a price, why does the law apply specifically to 1 scroll? Even if the sacred writings were contained in 2 scrolls, they should also not divide them, since the respective parts will not be even and one of the recipients will have to compensate the other. And Rav Shalman interpreted the Mishnah, it is referring to a case where they both want to divide the sacred writings. Therefore, Shmuel said that they may do so if it's already divided into 2 separate scrolls. But if just one of them wishes to divide them, there is no proof that he can compel the other one to accept the division, right? If one of them says, I want to keep one of the scrolls, you take the other, and the other one says, no, they need to be kept together, then we don't have a proof that we would force the division in this case, since we are talking about holy writings, and the general principle is that we do not divide holy writings. Only Shmuel says you could divide if it was already split into 2 scrolls. We know you can't cut a single scroll in half. Unclear if the brother who wants to divide the 2 separate scrolls can force the reluctant brother to accept that. A Maimar said, the halacha is in accordance with the opinion of Rav Yehuda, that there is a law of either you set or I will set the price, and one can force the buyout. So Rav Ashi said to a Maimar, what about the statement of Rav Nachman, who disagrees with Rav Yehuda and says that we do not have a halacha of you set and I will set? A Maimar said to him, I don't know about that, which is to say, I do not maintain this opinion, right? He agrees that with Rav Yehuda that we do have this law. And the Gemara asks, and is the law not in accordance with the opinion of Rav Nachman? But it happened that the father of Ravin Bar Chinana and Rav Dimi Bar Chinana died and left them 2 brothers, and the father died and left them 2 maidservants, one of whom knew how to bake and cook, and the other one knew how to spin and weave. In other words, there were 2 female slaves in the household that were a team. Neither one could run the household by herself. One handled the kitchen, the other handled the rest of the chores around the house, right? And they made a perfect team together. So now you have a situation where you have 2 slaves and inherited by 2 brothers. So on the one hand, you could say, okay, well, one brother takes 1 slave and the other brother takes the other slave. But since they function as a unit, right, since neither one can do all the work of the household by herself, do they divide or do they not? So what happened? One of the brothers suggested that each of them take one of the maidservants entirely for himself and forfeit his rights to the other maidservant. And presumably the other brother did not agree. And they came before Rava, and he said to them, there is no halacha of either you set or I will set a price. Right? So if you will... And then the question is, if there is that halacha, how are we going to apply it? Are we going to say, so you take one of the slaves and I'll take the other? Or are we going to say, so we sell the 2 slaves to somebody who, can afford to buy both, and then we split the proceeds? What are we going to do with either you set or I will set? So the Gemara answers, it is different there. Since this master wanted both of them, and the other master wanted both of them. Therefore, when one of the brothers said to the other, you take one and I will take the other, it is not a case of either you set or I will set a price. And the Gemara, meaning they both understood that the 2 slaves should go together as a team. And the Gemara asks, and can we not say so? But there is the case of sacred writings, which both of them presumably want. And Shmuel said they taught that sacred writings should not be divided only if they're contained in a single scroll. But when they are contained in two scrolls, then they may be divided. And the Gemara answers, Rav Shalman interpreted the Mishnah. It is referring to a case where they both want to divide the sacred writings, and in such a case they may divide them, provided that they're in two scrolls. But if only one wants to make the division and the other doesn't, then even if the writings are contained, like the whole book of Psalms has been written into two scrolls, we do not divide the two scrolls if one of the brothers is reluctant to do that. Now, new subject. The Gemara begins a general discussion about sacred writings. So the sages taught that a person may attach the Torah, the prophets, and the writings together as one scroll. And this is the statement of Rabbi Meir. And Rabbi Yehuda says the Torah should be a scroll by itself, the books of the prophets a scroll by themselves, and the books of the writings a scroll by themselves. And the sages say each one of the books of the prophets and the writings should be a scroll by itself, right? Meaning the book of Isaiah should be its own scroll. The book of Jeremiah should be its own scroll. The book of Psalms should be its own scroll. The Torah obviously is its own scroll, etc. Proverbs should be its own scroll, right? So before we were fortunate enough, to have books that could contain everything. When everything was done as scrolls, it was very different. Now, this is not an actual Torah scroll. It's kind of a model of a scroll that was part of an award. But just for people who are not so familiar with what a Torah looks like, this is like a model, like a miniature representation of a Torah. Torah is much larger than this, usually. But this is how a Torah is normally laid out on two dowels, right? And then you could, turn it back and forth as you move through the Torah over the course of the year and doing the public readings in synagogue. And what we have right here at this gap is the beginning of the book that we're actually in right now, Bamidbar. In English, we could say that Numbers, but it really means Bamidbar, in the wilderness, the fourth book of the Torah, which begins here. And you see that it begins in the middle of a column, and we're going to start talking about that in a moment. Now, Rabbi Yehuda said there was an incident involving Beitos ben Zunin, who had 8 books of the prophets attached together as one scroll. And he did this with the approval of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. So if you say that the majority of the sages say that each of the books of the prophets and the writings needs to be on its own scroll, right? Jeremiah by itself, Isaiah by itself. Well, then what about this incident where 8 of those books, the parchment got sewn together and all 8 of them were wound around a single dowel, create one scroll out of those 8 books. And that was with the approval of the great sage Elazar ben Azariah. And others say that each and every one of the books was a scroll by itself in accordance with the opinion of the sages. So Rebbe said there was an incident where they brought before us the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, all of Tanakh, attached together as one scroll, and we ruled in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir and deemed them fit. That would be a very large scroll indeed. Now the Gemara states when different books are included in the same scroll, 4 empty lines of space should be left between each book of the Torah, and similarly between one book of the prophets and another. But between each of the books of the 12 prophets, only 3 empty lines should be left, because those are kind of a unit, because they are considered one book. And the scribe may finish a book at the bottom of one column and begin the next book at the top of the next column without leaving any empty space in between. The sages taught in a baraisa, one who wishes to attach the Torah, the prophets, and the writings together as one scroll may attach them, but he should leave enough empty parchment at the beginning of the scroll for winding around the pole to which the beginning of the scroll is fashioned, right? In other words, see, now this is a Torah, right, where it's two poles, one on each end. But if you've ever seen a Megillah, right? Like a book of Esther that we read at Purim, usually there's only the one dowel, the one pole on one side, and the entire Megillah is wound around one. And then you just kind of pull it out and then, eventually roll it back up. But a Torah, moves from one pole to another pole. Now, the other thing, so what they're saying is at the end, meaning at the beginning, right? Like at the beginning of the Torah, in the beginning of God's creating the heaven and the earth, etc., there needs to be enough parchment, and enough cloth, the paper, which is actually made out of animal hide, for it to wind around the pole and not interfere with the writing once we get to the writing. And likewise, at the end, there has to be enough blank space so that if you're going to wind it around one dowel, it can get all the way around without curving the writing or without interfering too much with the writing. That there has to be a layer of paper around the whole thing. You would see that at the end of a Megillah, right? So like in this image of a single pole, a scroll around a single scroll. But so it's one thing whether you have one pole or two, but the question they're actually talking about is, would you just extend the scroll once the Torah ends and then pick it up with the book of Joshua, and then continue with Judges and Kings, etc., or do you need separate scrolls, or at least division between Torah, and the writings, or Torah and the prophets, or can you put it all into a single scroll? And if you can put it in a single scroll, then how do you indicate divisions? So, like as I showed you here, between books of the Torah, right, between the end of Leviticus and the beginning of the book of Numbers, there's only this, a space of a few lines within the column. But if you were going to put it in a single scroll and go from the Torah to the book of Joshua, then you wouldn't do that. Then you could, sort of finish a column and then start a new column with the next book. And maybe you would even leave some blank columns, but that's a different question. Okay, so the sages taught in a Baraisa. One who wishes to attach the Torah, the prophets, and the writings together as one scroll may attach them. He should leave enough empty parchment at the beginning of the scroll for winding around the pole to which the beginning of the scroll is fastened. And at the end of the scroll, he should leave enough empty parchment for winding around the entire circumference of the rolled up scroll. And he may finish a book at the bottom of one column and begin the next book at the top of the next column without leaving any empty lines between them. And I guess he doesn't need empty columns. Now we're on page 14a. It was a short daf. Let's get a little bit of a head start on tomorrow. And like I said, since I'm traveling in 1 week's time, it would be good to get a little bit ahead. Anyway, so on 14a, and if he wishes to cut the scroll, he may cut it. And the Gemara expresses surprise. What is the Tana saying? We said we don't cut scrolls. Why mention here cutting the scroll? And the Gemara answers, this is what the Tana is saying. He arranges the text so that if he finishes a book at the bottom of one column, he begins the next book at the top of the next column without leaving any empty space, so that if he wishes to cut the scroll, he may cut it. If he does not begin the next book at the top of the next column, he will not be able to cut the scroll because it is not fitting for a scroll to begin with empty space. Although there needs to be enough space to attach it to the pole. So, let's keep reading. Now, the Gemara raised a contradiction. Yeah, exactly. The Gemara raised a contradiction between this Baraisa and another Baraisa that teaches enough parchment should be left at the beginning of the scroll and at its end for winding. And so for winding around a pole. So the Gemara clarifies, for winding around what? If it means for winding around the pole to which the beginning of the scroll is fastened, this is difficult in light of what is taught in the first Baraisa, which at the end of a scroll, enough parchment should be left for winding around the entire circumference of the scroll, right? When it's all wound and we have the end of the scroll at the end, right? It's not just the pole, right? It's all this parchment, miles of it, right? And many, many yards of it wound around the pole. And so at the end of the book, there needs to be enough extra parchment to wind around that whole thickness of the scroll. That's not just the much smaller amount that you would need to wind around the dowel, right? The little wood pole at the center of that. And if it means for winding around the entire circumference, then this is difficult in light of what is taught in the first baraisa, that at the beginning of the scroll, there needs to be enough parchment for winding around just the pole. So Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said, the Tana teaches the law disjunctively. He's referring to two separate cases. He issues a general statement requiring that enough parchment be left for winding as needed. At the beginning, for winding around the pole, and at the end, for winding around the whole scroll. And Rav Ashi said, when that second baraisa is taught, indicating that the same measure of parchment is left at both the beginning and the end of the scroll, it was referring to a Torah scroll. As it is taught in a baraisa, all other scrolls are wound from the beginning to the end around a single pole. But a Torah scroll is wound from both ends to the middle around two poles, one of which he attaches at this end of the scroll and the other at the other end. So Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Rabbi Tzadok, said this is how the scribes in Jerusalem made their scrolls, i.e. with poles at either end so that it could be rolled to the middle. In other words, other books were made around two poles also, like the Torah scroll. And most of us, don't often see other books of the Bible, wound like this, like a Torah scroll. We see this all the time, right? And every time we're in synagogue on Shabbos, we bring out a Torah like that and read from it. Again, much bigger. A Torah is about this tall, usually, sometimes like this. Sometimes there are small ones like this, just in terms of the height. But the ones we read from in synagogue are typically about this tall, just in terms of from the bottom of the parchment to the top. And then there are the handles below and above that people use to carry and roll them, etc. Okay, the sages taught a Torah scroll should not be made in such a manner that its length, meaning its height, is greater than its circumference when it is rolled up, nor should its circumference be greater than its length. Right, so this idea that this is sort of like proportionally speaking, that this measure, when this is taken out, right, and rolled up, and then it would have a cover on it in synagogue. Again, this is just a model. This is not a real Torah. It's made out of regular paper, not animal parchment, and it's printed, not written by hand by a sofer, by a scribe. But normally in temple, in synagogue, this is what you see, right? The Torah gets rolled up like this, then they put a cover over it. People carry it, they deposit it, in the holy ark where the Torahs are stored. So what they're saying is that, this measurement of its height should basically be able to wind around the Torah scroll. That the height is equal approximately to the circumference. Right, so Torah scroll should not be made in such a manner that its height is greater than its circumference. You wouldn't want it to seem too tall. Nor that its circumference should be greater than its height, and you wouldn't want it to be too squat, right? So what should the size of a Torah scroll be? And Rebbe said to them, if it was written on a hide that was treated with gall nuts, this is known as gevel, it should be 6 handbreadths long, right? So 6, here, right? Handbreadths. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? So about like this, and that's about right. That's about the height of the parchment of a Torah scroll. That's approximately right. Should be about 6 handbreadths long. And they asked him further, well, how much should it be if it was written on ordinary cloth, on ordinary parchment? And Rebbe said, I do not know. And so what he's saying is, right, that if the paper, the parchment itself, the animal hide, depending on how it's treated, it's either going to be thicker or thinner. And if it's thinner, then when the whole thing is wound up, it's going to have a smaller circumference, right? So if it's made with thinner paper, maybe it needs to be a little bit shorter. Whereas if it's made with much thicker paper, that's going to expand its circumference, and therefore it should be a little bit taller. It is related that Rav Huna wrote 70 Torah scrolls himself, and it happened for him only once. So he must have been a scribe, and in all those Sefer Torahs that he wrote, 70 of them, it only happened once that the length and the circumference were exactly equal. Right? They're approximately the same. It's never exactly the same. So in the 70 that he wrote, only once were they exactly equal. And Rav Acha Bar Yaakov wrote 1 Torah scroll on calf hide, and it happened to have the same length and circumference. And the sages looked at him and his achievement with jealousy, and he died from their envious gaze. I don't know what to make of that story. The sages said to Rav Hamnuna, Rabbi Ami wrote 400 Torah scrolls. Rav Hamnuna said to them, perhaps he wrote the verse, Moses commanded us the Torah, Deuteronomy 33:4. Maybe he wrote that verse 400 times, rather than 400 complete Sefer Torahs, as it is difficult to say that he could have written so many even in an entire lifetime. Similarly, Rava said to Rabbi Zera, Rabbi Yanai planted 400 vineyards. And Rava said to him, perhaps he did not plant large vineyards, but only the smallest possible vineyards recognized by law, which are composed of 2 vines facing another 2 vines with a 5th one protruding like a tail, extending out beyond the square, right? Because otherwise, how could a person plant 400 vineyards? It's just not feasible. So it must be, that he planted something that could be called a vineyard, 400 versions of that. The Gemara raises an objection to that, to what is taught with regard to the length of a Torah scroll from a Baraisa. With regard to the Ark of the Covenant that Moses fashioned, right, the Ark that they carried in the wilderness and that was later stored in the Holy of Holies in the Holy Temple. So with regard to the Ark of the Covenant that Moses fashioned or supervised its construction, its length was 2 1/2 cubits, its width was 1 1/2 cubits, and its height was 1 1/2 cubits, right? Because the Torah specifies those measurements. And the cubit used for these measurements being 6 handbreadths. Therefore, the ark was 15 handbreadths long, 9 handbreadths wide, and 9 handbreadths high. I'm almost done, so you got questions or comments, please get them in now. Why are they talking about the measurements of the Holy Ark in the wilderness? Because there was the original Torah that Moses wrote as God was dictating to him. And where was it stored? In the Ark of the Covenant, alongside the tablets of the 10 Commandments. So what they're asking is, well, now that we know the dimensions of the Ark, how much room was inside there, and could we have stored the tablets and a Sefer Torah? Isn't that going to tell us the maximum size of a Sefer Torah? So the Baraisa continues, and as for the tablets of the 10 Commandments, their length was 6 handbreadths, their width was 6 handbreadths, and their thickness was 3 handbreadths, which, 6 handbreadths, we just said, is about like that. So they're this tall, this wide, each tablet, and about that thick, made of stone. Right? These things weighed hundreds and hundreds of pounds. Right? So when you have that image in your mind of Moses, walking down Mount Sinai carrying the 2 tablets, or Mel Brooks 3, and he drops one. But really, carrying the 2 tablets, there's no human could do that. How was Moses able to do it? Obviously, because he had God's assistance, right? The tablets were sort of like floating, and Moses was guiding them down the mountain because he couldn't have carried them. That's how big and heavy they were. Okay, so now we get that picture, right? The tablets like this, by this thick, okay? The tablets were placed along the length of the ark, one next to the other. If so, how much space did the tablets occupy along the length of the ark? 12 handbreadths, as each tablet was 6 handbreadths long. 3 handbreadths were left there along the length of the ark for a total of 15 handbreadths. Deduct a handbreadth from them, 1/2 a handbreadth for this wall of the ark, namely the thickness of the wooden ark itself, and a half for the other wall. So accordingly, what's left? 2 handbreadths were left there in which the Torah scroll written by Moses lay. Now that's when it's rolled up, so not a bad approximation. If we're saying it's 6 handbreadths high and a circumference, right? Now we're talking about the diameter versus the circumference, right? So we're saying 2 handbreadths maybe is the diameter of the Torah scroll. And what biblical source indicates that a Torah scroll was placed there? As it is stated, there was nothing in the ark except the 2 tablets of stone which Moses put there. That's from 1 Kings 8:9. Well, what does "there was nothing in the ark except" mean? Well, this is an example of a restriction following a restriction, as both terms "nothing" and "except" indicate that the ark was empty. And there is a hermeneutical principle that a restriction following a restriction serves to amplify. In other words, a double negative becomes a positive and includes other matters. And what does it include? In this case, it serves to include a Torah scroll that lies in the ark. And we'll knock off there. Make a note to continue tomorrow. And it's funny, Nina and I are putting together the joke book, right? I told you before that we got a book deal. We're going to be publishing Let My People Laugh. And so I just saw this joke today that I'll share with you, sneak preview. So at a conference at the annual conference of the Comparative Language Society, Nina would never let me tell a joke that I haven't rehearsed 10 times, and this is why. She's right, and I'm wrong, but I'm just going to stumble it out anyway. But at the annual conference of the Society of Comparative Languages, a professor is on stage explaining that in many, many languages of the world, a double negative can be used as a positive, right? With the example being, she is not unlike her sister, means that she is like her sister, right? But says the professor, we don't have any language in the world where a double positive can be used to express a negative. And Sally Goldstein in the back of the room says, yeah. Okay. Sharon, can the poor brother use his days to rent out the bathhouse or olive press, even if the other brother uses his days for personal use? Excellent question. Why not? And I would assume the reason is because they're not located on the property in such a way that you would rent it out, right? It's like maybe one of the brothers, like maybe they even divided the property, and so there's two houses, one beside the other, but the olive press or the bathhouse is situated like it's for the use of the residents of the property, even if there are two houses on that property now, as opposed to one when the father lived there. But it's not the kind of situation where you would invite members of the public to come in and use it. I would assume that's why that solution was not on the table, because otherwise it would be a good solution. Jonathan, dividing scroll. With respect to dividing scrolls. Okay, so now I wonder what the law is with respect to scrolls on two screens, or putting one part of the Torah behind a paywall. Is it disrespectful to close a window that has the word of Hashem on it, or teku? I mean, I think what you're asking me is when you're electronically viewing scripture, is it bad to divide, columns of the Torah across two screens, like I use two screens on my computer? And I would say that generally speaking, you can't use your screens on Shabbos. Otherwise, there are very practical ways to learn as much Torah as you ever want to learn. And we don't consider that when you have turned off your screen that you in any way destroyed or desecrated, scripture, right? Because it's electronic, it's ephemeral, it doesn't really live, it hasn't been written by a sofer, and so it's not considered disrespectful, whatever you do to it. Having said that, like what's a wonderful thing on my phone and your phone, and everyone's phone should have it. First of all, you should have the AT app, right? And there's a lot of scripture in different realms of the AT app. But also you should have Sefaria, right? You should have Sefaria. So Sefaria is a wonderful app that has all of Tanakh, right? The whole Bible, all of the Mishna, all of the Talmud, just available in an app on your phone. Incredible, right? So, you're waiting online at the bank, instead of just sitting there, you could be learning something. You could be learning that day's daf or that week's parsha or something. So you can learn wherever you are. Can you open the Sefaria app and read some Torah or Talmud when you're sitting in the bathroom? No. So even though you didn't bring a book right, of Torah into the bathroom. Like you just wouldn't do that. You wouldn't bring, your Bible, your Tanakh into the bathroom with you because that's very disrespectful. You do bring your phone in there with you, even though it has an app on it that contains all of Scripture. You could still bring your phone into the bathroom with you, but you wouldn't open that app in the bathroom, and you wouldn't be reading Scripture while you're in the bathroom. So hopefully that's helpful. Sharon, so is the division of a scroll prohibited because it desecrated the scroll? But if the idea is that you want to keep the writings together for the sake of retaining the entirety of the writing, right? So that's, I'm not sure when you asked the question, but it's such an important question. Are we saying you can't cut the scroll? And why are we saying you can't cut the scroll? One of the reasons might be because if you cut it, you won't have enough material to wrap around a pole, right? And so it would be left hanging, and that would be disgraceful to it. But maybe you don't have that problem. So then, is it disgraceful simply because you cut it, right? And it was a single scroll, and now it's become 2 half scrolls. But why is that a problem? Is it because you divided the book? But then why does Shmuel say that if one book has already been divided into 2 scrolls and it was inherited by 2 people, that they can divide? One take half the book, the other take half the book, as long as what they're taking are complete scrolls. I don't have the answer, but it's an important question. Lucy, if a Megillah does not get rolled on a second dowel, then how is it read? A Megillah like Esther is pretty long. Yeah, so what you'll see, it's kind of done in different ways, but very often, like a nice big proper Megillah, like people will use to read from on Purim, is they'll unroll the whole thing. They'll take it completely off the dowel, and then they'll kind of fold it, so you can imagine it's sort of like, it's sort of like this, right? And it's even longer, a longer rectangle, but there would be columns, right? So it'd be columns of writing, a column, a column, a column, a column, right? So what they would do is they would kind of fold it like this, right? And then the reader, will have it on the bima, right? On the shulchan, on the table on which he's reading to the rest of the room. And as he reads, he'll do this, and then it's Hebrew, right? So, like that. So he reads this, and then he reads that, and then he reads that, and then he reads that. And then at the end, they'll roll it back onto the dowel. And Sharon says, right, Megillat Esther is not that long. It's only 10 chapters, and the last is very short. And it is not read rolled at all. Okay, so what I just explained is what Sharon is explaining. Exactly. So, interesting class, right? Interesting class. Some of the halachas of actually creating Sefer Torahs. And if you ever have the opportunity to attend the dedication of a Sefer Torah, when somebody commissions a Torah to be written, it's incredibly expensive, by the way. When people have a Sefer Torah written, it kind of starts at like $50,000. And that's a reasonable price because, the sofer, the scribe, he will work for months and months and months, sometimes years. And like every single letter and every column has to obey many, many rules. He has to have supreme focus and intentionality the whole time. So usually when somebody commissions a Sefer Torah, it gets delivered, 1, 2, 3 years later. And then the person will probably make a party. And then the last few letters are not yet written, and then people who are donating, sometimes the synagogue has commissioned the Sefer Torah, and a lot of people have donated to that, and they get to put their hand on the scribe's arm while he's finishing it, right? The last few words are written, in front of this crowd who are gathered to celebrate that Torah scroll. And then there's often like a parade, bringing it from the place where it was finished to the synagogue where it's going to be used, or the home where it's going to be kept. But it's a very colorful ceremony. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Gimel Tammuz, the 3rd of the month of Tammuz, the Lubavitcher Rebbe's yard site, to continue our journey through Bava Basra. Have a great night.